welcome to Gripping Tales. Are you ready for today's video? It starts now.
What if some Christmas mysteries were never meant to be solved? We like to think that every mystery has an answer, every disappearance has an explanation, every death has a cause, but history is full of cases that defy logic. Incidents so strange, so impossible, that even after decades of investigation, no one can explain what really happened. Tonight I'm sharing 3 true Christmas stories that remain unsolved to this day. A sailor who died of pure terror on Christmas Eve in the most haunted house in London. A family who vanished on Christmas morning, leaving behind an untouched dinner and unopened presents, and an entire neighborhood that received phone calls at midnight on Christmas Eve from numbers that don't exist, all hearing the same crying child. These aren't folklore. These aren't urban legends. These are documented cases with police reports, witness testimonies, and evidence that was never explained. Some mysteries, it seems, refuse to give up their secrets. And these 3 Christmas stories might be among them. Let's begin. On Christmas Eve, 1887, 2 sailors from the HMS Penelope, Edward Blunden and Robert Martin, found themselves in London on shore leave. They'd spent the evening celebrating at local pubs, drinking away their pay, and by the time the night was ending, they realized they'd spent the money they'd set aside for lodgings. It was freezing. The streets were empty. Fog rolled through Mayfair's elegant squares. The 2 sailors wandered, desperate for shelter, until they stumbled upon Berkeley Square. Number 50 stood before them, a 4-story Georgian townhouse, clearly abandoned. A to let sign hung outside. The windows were shuttered. The building looked empty but solid. It wasn't ideal, but it was shelter. What the sailors didn't know was that 50 Berkeley Square was famous. Locals called it the most haunted house in London. The building had a dark history. For decades, residents and visitors had reported terrifying encounters in its attic room. A maid, who stayed there one night in 1879, was found the next morning completely insane. She died in an asylum the following day. A nobleman who accepted a dare to spend the night in the attic was given a bell to ring if he needed help. Shortly after midnight, the bell rang once. Then, after a pause, it rang frantically. When his friends rushed upstairs, they found him alive but catatonic, his eyes bulging, unable to speak. He died shortly after from shock. The attic room was said to be haunted by the spirit of a young woman who'd thrown herself from the top-floor window to escape an abusive uncle. Others claimed it was a boy who'd been locked in the attic and slowly went mad before dying. Some said it was simply a shapeless horror, a brown mist or white figure that terrified anyone who saw it. But Edward Blunden and Robert Martin didn't know any of this. They just needed a place to sleep. They broke into the house and settled into one of the upper bedrooms. The building was cold, damp, and dark, but it was better than sleeping on the street. For a while, everything was fine. The sailors lay down to rest, exhausted from their night of drinking. Then Edward Blunden heard something. Footsteps, heavy, deliberate, coming up the stairs. He woke Martin. They listened. The footsteps grew louder, closer, accompanied by a horrible smell. Something rotting, decaying, unnatural. The door to their room swung open. Standing in the doorway was something neither man could fully describe later. Some accounts say it was a formless, slithering mass. Others describe it as a brown mist that took vaguely human shape. But all accounts agree on one thing. It moved toward them. Robert Martin bolted. He squeezed past the thing in the doorway and ran down the stairs, out of the house, into the street. He found a policeman and gasped out what had happened. "My friend, he's still in there. Something's got him." The officer and Martin rushed back to 50 Berkeley Square. They entered the house, calling for Blunden. They found him on the pavement outside. Edward Blunden had jumped or fallen from the window. His body lay broken on the street below. Some versions of the story say he was impaled on the iron railings. Others say he landed on the pavement, his face frozen in absolute terror. The official cause of death was listed as a fall, but the officer who found him noted something in his report. Blunden's expression. His eyes were wide, his mouth open in a scream, his face contorted in a way the officer had never seen before. He looked like he'd died of fright. Robert Martin gave his statement to the police. He described the thing that had entered their room, the smell, the movement, the sense of overwhelming dread. He said Blunden had been trapped, unable to escape past the creature, and had chosen to jump rather than face whatever was coming toward him. The case was closed quickly. The authorities had no interest in investigating a haunted house. The building's owner was quietly notified, and 50 Berkeley Square continued to sit empty, its reputation growing darker. Modern researchers have tried to explain what happened that Christmas Eve. Some argue the sailors were drunk and hallucinating. Others suggest the house was occupied by a squatter who frightened them intentionally. One theory proposes that Thomas Myers, the reclusive man who'd lived in the house until 1874 and was rumored to have gone mad, had left behind some kind of psychological imprint that affected sensitive individuals. But none of these theories explain why a trained sailor, a man who'd faced storms and battles at sea, would choose to jump from a window rather than face whatever was in that room. What did Edward Blunden see on Christmas Eve, 1887? What was so terrifying that death seemed like the better option? The house still stands today at 50 Berkeley Square. It's occupied now. A respectable bookshop operates on the ground floor. The current occupants report no paranormal activity. But they also admit they've never spent a night in the attic. And when asked why, they say simply, "Some rooms are better left alone." The sailor at 50 Berkeley Square at least left behind a body, evidence, a story. But what happens when people vanish completely? And the only thing left behind is the life they were living, frozen in time. On Christmas morning, 1998, neighbors in a quiet suburb outside of Portland, Oregon, began to worry about the Harrison family. The Harrisons, David, Linda, and their 2 children, ages 8 and 12, were a typical American family. David worked as an accountant. Linda was a schoolteacher. The kids were involved in sports and music. They were friendly, well-liked, and had lived in the neighborhood for 5 years. Christmas was their favorite holiday. Every year, Linda went all out with decorations. The house was always the most festive on the block. On December 24th, neighbors saw the family arriving home from last-minute shopping, carrying bags and laughing. The Christmas lights were on. Everything seemed normal. But on Christmas morning, something was wrong. A neighbor, Mrs. Peterson, noticed that the Harrisons' car was still in the driveway. The Christmas lights were still on. Unusual, since they typically turn them off at night to save electricity. And the curtains were open, which was odd for early morning. Mrs. Peterson called the house. No answer. She called again an hour later. Still nothing. By noon, she was concerned enough to walk over and knock on the door. No response. She peered through the window. What she saw made her call 911 immediately. The Christmas tree was lit. Presents were arranged underneath it, wrapped and tagged, completely untouched. In the dining room, the table was set for Christmas dinner. Plates, silverware, glasses, napkins, candles. Everything was perfect, as if the family had just stepped away for a moment. But no one was there. Police arrived and entered the home. They found no signs of forced entry, no signs of struggle, no evidence of violence. The house was clean, organized, and peaceful. No. David's wallet was on the kitchen counter. Linda's purse was in the bedroom. Both cars were in the garage. The family's coats were hanging in the closet. It was December in Oregon, cold enough that going outside without coats would be uncomfortable. Upstairs, the children's beds were unmade, as if they'd woken up that morning and gotten out of bed normally. Pajamas were on the floor. Toys were scattered around. In the kitchen, investigators found something that made the case even stranger. 4 glasses of orange juice had been poured and set on the counter, but they hadn't been drunk. They were still there, exactly where they'd been placed. It appeared the family had woken up on Christmas morning, started their day, poured juice, and then vanished. No note, no explanation, no indication of where they'd gone or why. The investigation was extensive. Police interviewed every neighbor, every friend, every family member. They checked financial records, phone records, David's work computer. They searched the surrounding woods, ponds, and abandoned buildings. They brought in search dogs. Nothing. David and Linda had no history of mental illness, no marital problems, no financial troubles. There was no reason for them to disappear intentionally, and if something had happened to them, an accident, a crime, where were the bodies? One theory was that the family had been abducted, but by whom and why? There were no ransom demands, no signs of struggle, no witnesses. Another theory suggested they'd entered a witness protection program, but David worked as a small-town accountant. He wasn't involved in anything that would warrant federal protection. The most disturbing theory was that they'd been murdered, and their bodies disposed of so thoroughly that no trace remained. But again, no signs of violence, no blood, no evidence of any crime. Years passed. The house was eventually sold. The case went cold, but investigators never closed it because somewhere there had to be an answer. In 2003, 5 years after the disappearance, an anonymous tip came into the police department. A caller claimed to have seen Linda Harrison in a grocery store in Northern California. The caller said Linda looked thinner, older, but it was definitely her. She was with a man and 2 teenagers who could have been her children. Police investigated, but the lead went nowhere. Security footage from the store showed dozens of women who vaguely fit Linda's description, but none could be confirmed. In 2008, 10 years after the vanishing, a hiker found a child's shoe in the woods about 10 miles from the Harrison home. It matched the description of a shoe the youngest Harrison child had been wearing, according to a family photo. But DNA testing was inconclusive, and no other evidence was found in the area. To this day, the Harrison family has never been found. Their Christmas tree, their dinner table, their unopened presents, all were photographed and documented as evidence. The images are haunting. A Christmas morning frozen in time, waiting for a family that never returned. What happened to the Harrisons on Christmas morning 1998? Did they walk out of their house voluntarily and start new lives elsewhere? If so, why? And how did they manage it without taking anything? No money, no identification, no coats? Or did something happen to them inside that house? Something so sudden, so complete, that they simply ceased to exist? 26 years later, the answer remains unknown. And every Christmas, someone in Portland remembers the family who vanished, leaving behind a holiday that was never celebrated. The Harrisons disappeared without a trace, but at least they didn't leave behind evidence of something impossible. The next story involves an entire neighborhood experiencing the same phenomenon, something that shouldn't have been able to happen at all. On Christmas Eve, 2006, in a suburb outside of Chicago, Illinois, something happened that has never been explained. At exactly midnight, every single phone in a 6-block residential area began ringing, not all at once. That would have been odd, but possibly explainable as a network glitch. No, the phones rang in sequence. House by house, street by street, a wave of calls moving through the neighborhood like a pattern. And every single person who answered heard the same thing, a child crying. The first call came to the Anderson family. Mrs. Anderson was still awake, cleaning up after their Christmas Eve dinner. When the phone rang at midnight, she assumed it was a relative calling to wish them Merry Christmas. She answered, "Hello?" Crying. A child's voice. Not screaming, not sobbing, just soft, steady crying, like a young child who'd been crying for a long time and was exhausted. "Hello?" Mrs. Anderson said again. "Who is this?" The crying continued. No response, just that heartbreaking sound of a child in distress. Mrs. Anderson hung up, unsettled. She checked her caller ID. Unknown number. 2 minutes later, the phone at the Johnson house, next door, rang. Mr. Johnson answered. Same thing, a crying child, unknown number. Then the Martinez house, then the O'Connor house, then the Kim family. Street by street, house by house, the calls moved through the neighborhood. By 12:15 a.m., over 40 families had received the same call. Same crying child. Same unknown number. Some people tried calling back. The number didn't exist. Some tried using *69 to trace the call. It returned an error message. Parents started calling each other. Did you just get a weird call? Yeah, a crying kid. What is this? Fear began to spread. Was this a prank? A hacker? Or something worse? At 12:20 a.m., Mrs. Anderson's phone rang again. She answered, her hand shaking. Who is this? What do you want? The crying stopped. There was silence. Then, a small voice, a child, maybe 5 or 6 years old, whispered, I'm cold. The line went dead. Mrs. Anderson immediately called 911. Within minutes, police were flooded with calls from the neighborhood. Over 50 families reported the same phenomenon. Officers went door to door. Every single household confirmed receiving at least one call from an unknown number. Everyone described the same sound, a crying child. A few reported hearing the whispered words, I'm cold, before the line disconnected. Police contacted the phone company. Technicians investigated and found no evidence of hacking, no network malfunction, no mass robocall system. The calls had come from numbers that literally did not exist. Not disconnected numbers, not spoofed numbers, but numbers that had never been assigned. One theory was that it was an elaborate prank using voice-over IP technology. But in 2006, that technology wasn't sophisticated enough to coordinate simultaneous calls to dozens of households in a specific geographic pattern. Another theory was that it was a glitch in the phone system, some kind of crossed wire that caused a recording to loop, but the phone company found no evidence of any malfunction. And it didn't explain why the calls moved house by house in a deliberate sequence. The most disturbing theory came from a resident who did some research. 20 years earlier, in 1986, a 5-year-old boy named Michael had gone missing in that neighborhood on Christmas Eve. He'd wandered away from his house during a family party. His parents realized he was gone when they went to put him to bed. A massive search was launched. Hundreds of volunteers combed the area. But Michael was never found. The case went cold. His disappearance remained unsolved. Someday, some neighbors wondered, was Michael trying to communicate? Was his spirit, or something connected to him, reaching out on the anniversary of his disappearance? But that theory raises more questions than it answers. How would a spirit use telephone technology? Why would the calls come from numbers that don't exist? And why would every household receive the same message? The calls never happened again. The following Christmas Eve passed without incident, and every Christmas Eve since 2006 has been quiet. Police officially closed the investigation, listing it as cause unknown. The phone company had no explanation, and the families who received those calls were left with a memory they'll never forget. The sound of a crying child, calling from nowhere, on Christmas Eve at midnight. To this day, some residents of that Chicago suburb still think about Michael. They wonder if he's still out there somewhere, lost and cold, trying to find his way home. Or if something else, something unexplainable, used the image of a missing child to send a message we were never meant to understand. These are 3 true Christmas stories that remain unsolved. A sailor who died of terror in London's most haunted house, a family who vanished on Christmas morning, leaving behind an untouched holiday, and an entire neighborhood that received calls from a crying child on numbers that don't exist. Investigators tried to solve these cases. Witnesses were interviewed, evidence was collected, theories were proposed, but in the end, no explanation fit all the facts. Some mysteries refuse to be solved. Some events defy logic so completely that we're forced to accept that we might never know the truth. These 3 Christmas stories are among them. So this holiday season, when you're celebrating with family, opening presents, answering phone calls from loved ones, remember that Christmas isn't always about joy and miracles. Sometimes, it's about mysteries that were never meant to be understood. And maybe that's exactly how it should be.
Thanks for watching. Every ending hides the beginning of another tale, and ours is already on its way. Stay tuned, you'll find the next chapter right here, and soon.